everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 2 in your textbook, which is Basic Operations in SPSS. If we were doing this in a real in-person classroom, I would be up the front showing you how to use SPSS, and you would all probably have a computer in front of you and be following along with me. So since we're doing this online, I'm going to be showing you how to do these different functions in SPSS, and I do want you to follow along, which may mean you've got to toggle back and forth between this video as well as your own SPSS screen where you can be typing things in. And there may be points where you need to pause my lecture and then go ahead and do that step in SPSS on your own, so that you're going back and forth between listening to my lecture, seeing how to do something, and then you practicing doing it on your own computer, and that's going to help you when it comes to doing the homework and doing the assessments and the final project and the final exam. But the point of my lectures is for me to show you what to do, and then for you to actually practice doing it to be sure that you're understanding how to do these different functions. And if at any point you are confused, my lecture isn't helping, the textbook isn't helping, then please be sure to email me and I will do what I can to help you figure it out. So that's how I expect these lectures to go. This lecture will be very closely based on the textbook. Some will be more closely based on the textbook and some won't, but this will be really quite, we're going to follow along with the textbook quite closely. So you probably want to have that next to you as well, because that's going to have your data sets in it that you need to enter. So I'm starting here on Chapter 2, talking about the very basic operations in SPSS, and that there are three main windows that you would see in SPSS. The first is this one, and so actually if you would open SPSS on your computer, typically it opens, mine is already open, but there may be a box here which gives you a list of some of your recently created SPSS items, and it allows you to open things from there. That box I typically close, and then you get right here to this screen. Also, let me let you know that I'm using a PC. There's SPSS for PC or Macs, depending on if you're using a Mac or a PC. Your data may look a little bit different, or your screen may look a little bit different. The functions are the same. It should work very, very much the same, but there may be slight differences. Also, you have the student version of SPSS, whereas I don't. So again, there may be some slight differences there. It may take you just a second to figure out where something is on your screen compared to mine, but these things should be very, very close to each other, so it shouldn't be any problem. So anyhow, when you open up SPSS, if you close that box that SPSS initially shows you kind of on top of this screen, which allows you to open some of your recently created SPSS files, you get to this window, which is called the Data Editor. And this is always the first window that you see and the first window that you're going to be dealing with. There's also what we call the IBM Statistics Viewer. That's where your output will be shown, and the output is after you run some kind of statistical test, you run means or standard deviations or a t-test, your results show up in this IBM SPSS Statistics Viewer. So that's where you're going to view your output or your results, which we don't see yet because we haven't run anything. And then there's also a third window called the Syntax Editor. You do not get the Syntax Editor in the student version of SPSS. So you won't have that. We won't talk about it. Your book often has some little sections that talks about things you can do in the Syntax Editor. We're going to ignore all of that because you won't have that on your computers, and we really don't need it. It's more important if you're moving on in statistics to higher level analyses. But for our purposes, we just are going to be using the Data Editor as well as the output window for the Statistics Viewer. So we're going to start with the data editor right here, and just to show you, there are two tabs at the bottom. There's the data view. This is where you're going to be entering in your data, which we'll do in just a minute. And then you can toggle over to variable view, and that's where you name your different variables. Okay, so we've got two different tabs here, the data view and the variable view, and those are all within our data editor. So we're going to start by creating new variables, and I'm using the data that's in your book, which has to do with cartoon characters and drinking beer. And I'll let you read on page 13, and there's a little cartoon there about why beer seems to be particularly important in statistics, at least according to this author. So you can read that on your own, but we'll use the variables that he's using here on page 14. And if you look at page 14 in your textbook, you can see there are 15 participants in this data. We have the number of beers per week each participant drinks and the brand of beer that they drink. So we actually have two different variables that we need to enter. You can see the numbers here down the side. Those already are there, and those represent your participant numbers. And up here are the variables we need to create. And in this case, we're going to need to create two variables. One being number of beers per week, and the other one being the brand of beer. Okay, and so when you actually look at the data editor, each row represents one person. So this would be participant 1, and then we put all their data in these different variable columns. This will be person 2, and all of the data here across the columns, person 3, and then the data goes across the columns. So each column is its own variable, and each row is its own participant. And you'll see how that works in a second. So the first thing we need to do is click on the variable view and create our variables. So the first variable we have is beers per week. So I just typed that right into the name of variable 1, and again, remember I'm under variable view now. Once you do that, and I'm just going to click away, some automatic things come up here. The type of variable is numeric. It gives you the width of the variable 8, meaning that you can use 8 characters or numbers in order to type in your data with 2 decimal places. So 8 numbers plus 2 decimal places, which is going to be fine for us. Obviously, if you've got something in the hundreds of millions, I don't know what you would be measuring, but you might need to make the width a little bit bigger. Typically, 8 with 2 decimal points is plenty for us. And then if you click back here to the data view, you're going to see beers per week shows up as your first variable. So there it is. We need our second variable, so again, clicking back to variable view, and this is the brand of beer, so beer brand. I'm just following exactly what they're using in your textbook. And going over here to the data view, now we've got beer week and beer brand. Now, let's think back to last week. Last week we talked about types of variables being score variables or group variables. Score variables were numeric variables, and group variables were ones where people fall into a particular group. So let's think about this and maybe pause for 1 second here and think which one of these variables would be a score variable and which might be a group variable. Well, beers per week is a score variable. It's answered with a number, right? We ask the participants, how many beers do you drink per week? And they give us a number, 1, 10, 0, 7, whatever that number is. So that is a score variable. Beer brand, however, what brand of beer do you drink? That is a group variable. People fall into a group. What type of beer do you drink? And they will tell you the brand, and that's a group, not a number. And so that goes over here to values. If you're a score variable, you leave values alone. But if your variable is a group variable, then you go over in here to values, click on it. When you click on it, you get these 3 dots. That lets you open the values area. And what you're going to do is add in the different groups that you are that are possible in your data set. So you can see on page 14 the different brands. And what you're going to do is come up with a single number to represent each brand, in this case brand of beer, that is a possible answer. The reason for that is that when you type in your data, you can just type in a single number, like 1 in this case is equal to the brand Bongo beer. So every time somebody says the brand of beer they drink is Bongo beer, all you have to do is type in a 1, and that's going to stand for Bongo beer. 2 in this case is going to stand for Swiller Light. And so when you have a lot of data to enter, imagine you have 100 participants or 500 participants. All you need to do is type in the number, and then that represents the whole entire name. You don't have to type in the entire name every single time, which helps because then you make less errors, and it obviously takes you a lot less time. So I'm following the value labels that they have here in the textbook. So 1, you add as your value, and the label here is Bongo beer. And then you have to hit add, and that goes down to this box here. 1 is now equal to Bongo beer. 2 is going to be equal to Swiller Light. Add that. 3 is going to be equal to Lights Out Lager. Add that. 4 is going to be equal to Budget Brew. 5 is Belcher's Pride. And 6 is going to be equal to Cirrhosis Light. Remember, you have to add them. I can tell you number of times I've just hit on I forget to hit add on the last value label. I hit OK, and it'll tell you the last add wasn't complete. So cancel and be sure to add it so you've got all your values there. If you wanted to make a change, you could click on, like, let's say Lights Out Lager. Maybe it was Lights Out Lagers. I spelled it wrong. You can make a change and then click change. You could also click on it and remove it if you put something in there that you didn't want or was an accident. But at this point, we've got our labels, and I just deleted them all. So let me put them in one more time. You should be doing this and following me at home. 2 is Swiller Light. 3 is Lights Out Lager. 4 is Budget Brew. 5 is Belcher's Pride. And 6 is Cirrhosis Light. Okay, there we go. One thing about SPSS, like I just did there, if you make a mistake, it's okay. It can be redone. It's not a problem. We're going to hit OK. Now we've got our values, and if you click this button again, you'll see the values are there. The last thing we want to do is also add a label. The variable names beer week and beer brand, those are shortened, abbreviated names for your variables that show up here in your variable view. It used to be you could only use 8 characters in earlier versions of SPSS, so these were really short abbreviations. Now you can add a few more characters, but at the same time, if you look at page 14, there are certain things that you can't do when you name your variables here. For instance, they can't start with a number. There can be no spaces. There are a lot of symbols that you can't use. So your options for naming the variables are pretty limited, and you end up with these weird-looking kind of shortened, abbreviated variables. However, back to variable view, on this label section, you can label them, and there are no rules to follow. You can use spaces, you can use symbols, etc. So for beer week, I might want to label that weekly beer consumption. I'll make this a little bigger so you can see it. And on your output and your results, you'll actually see this label. You won't see this one. And so this can be as descriptive as you want so that it makes sense. And this beer brand, I will type in brand of beer. So now I have my labels for my variables. And again, this is what will show up when I'm printing out my data, so you want it to be descriptive of what that data set is. You have your values labeled for any group variables you have, which in this case, this beer brand is a group variable. If you have a score variable, you don't need any values labeled, so that stays like that. And then when you go to your data view, if you just kind of hover over, you see the name of the variable beer week and then the label weekly beer consumption. And I can hover over this one and see brand of beer. So we're finally ready to enter our data. You can enter your data here, let me see, on page 14. That is the data we're going to be entering. So for person 1, and I'm just clicking on this first box here, you can see person 1 has 1 beer per week. And then over here, the beer brand is Bongo Beer, which is a 1. There it is. The next person, person 2, drinks 2 beers per week, and that person drinks Swiller Light, which is also a 2. And I'm getting this from table 2.1 in my textbook. The next person drinks 4 beers per week, and I'm just typing this in, and they also drink Swiller Light, which is a 2. You do have this little value labels button, which when you click on it, it'll change those numbers to the actual words, which again is nice. You didn't have to type all those words in or back to the numbers, so you can just go back and forth however you prefer to see it. So if you would finish up adding in those 15 participants data from table 2.1, so go ahead and do that. And when you have finished, it should look something like this, where we've got our 15 participants with their beers per week and the beer brand. And again, I can toggle this back and forth. You can make these columns bigger so everything fits. And there is your data set that you've entered into your data editor in SPSS. Okay. Your book also talks about, and this looks like it does on page 17, figure 2.4 in your textbook. At this point, your book talks about missing data, meaning if you accidentally come over here and, I don't know, put a number in and say, oh, I shouldn't have done that, and get rid of it, you can see that you've activated line 16, right? Line 16 now is in black type, you can see any lines that have data have black type instead of this gray type, meaning there's no data here. And each of these boxes now has a decimal point in it with no data. If you've accidentally done that and you have these boxes with these decimal points, SPSS considers that what we call missing data. Missing data isn't really a problem, and we will talk about it a little bit more. It's just saying, oh, maybe there was person 16, but they didn't answer the question. If you know that this is a mistake, you can get rid of that line by clicking on that line, going to edit, and clearing or deleting that line altogether. So you don't have that missing data. You'll see there will be points where missing data is appropriate, like if person 11 didn't give us their type of beer they like. Actually, I'll go to person 1, because I remember 1 is Bongo Brew, and get rid of that. We did have a person 1 who we know drinks 1 beer per week, but this missing data would be telling us, but they didn't tell us the brand. So this would be a piece of missing data. Put it back there by adding the 1 like that. But if you accidentally, type something in here, oh, I didn't need that. And now you've got these extra lines, and it was just a mistake. The easiest thing to do is just highlight those lines and delete them. So now we've got our data, and you've entered your first data in SPSS. Congratulations. Into your data editor. Remember, this is the data view where you're entering your data. Here's your variable view, which you've already set up the variables. And then the next thing we would do is save your data. So you definitely want to file, save or save as, and keep your data set. Especially if you're entering a lot of data, don't forget to save it, because you know, probably better than I know, that at some point you'll be halfway through and your computer will freeze or lose, its battery, and you don't want to lose your data. So be sure you save your data as you're going and save it frequently. There are different ways. You will save your data, and then your output files will be saved separately. So just be sure that as you're going, you're saving both of them. So go ahead and try to save your data right now. Page 19 talks about syntax files, which we are not going to use at all in this class. And the last thing, starting on page 22, is the output files. So once you do some kind of analysis, and I'm going to do an analysis that won't make any sense at the moment, we would go to Analyze. You can follow along with me. I'm going to do descriptive statistics and hit frequencies. Just to move these, I'm going to move these over, highlight them, use that arrow, and I'm going to hit OK. This is just as an example. We don't really care about the data here. I hit OK. And right now, I have an output file. Remember I said we have a statistics viewer where our output comes in. So you get these little different windows. This is the one we were just working on briefly, but this was my final data set. Should look a lot like yours. And then an output file. And so in this window, this is where your statistics will show up. Again, we haven't gone over any of these statistics, so I don't expect you to know them. But in this case, I ran a frequency distribution on weekly beer consumption and brand of beer. This is telling us that we had 15 people that answered how much beer they drank per week and the brand. And we have a frequency table for weekly beer consumption, how much beer people drank per week, and also a frequency table with brand of beer. Again, don't worry about these numbers. Really, I did this to just show you what an output file looks like, or our output window, or our statistics viewer. So this is where your statistics will show up, your means or your standard deviations or the results of your t-test. It's broken into these two areas. Here you've got kind of a log going, the output log, which tells us everything that was done. Here's says we ran frequencies. There's the title, any notes that were important. Here's the data set that it used. Here are the statistics that it ran. Here's the frequency tables that have a title. And there's the frequency table it's pointing out. Beer consumption and brand of beer. So you do have this log. And then this is where your data shows up in this portion of the window. And this becomes just a running list of all the statistics you do. So if you ran another statistic, let's say we go back to our data set and I'm interested in descriptive statistics. You don't have to follow along on this if you don't want, on weekly beer consumption, and hit OK. Now I've got my next, take me right back to the output. Here's my descriptive statistics that I just ran, and here they are, means and standard deviations. And so you can see this just becomes a long list of all of your statistics that you run, and it tells you on this log exactly what's been done. And again, if you wanted to save your output, you would go ahead and save this. It's a separate file. So you save your data as one file, and this output becomes a separate file. Okay, so I think we have introduced you to SPSS. You've used your data editor to enter data, and remember there's those two views, the variable view where you label your variables, make any values for group variables. You enter your data in the data view. After you analyze your data, you end up with an output file or a statistics viewer, and this is where all your statistics will show up. So if you have any questions, let me know, and good luck this week with Chapter 2. Thanks.